Well, all right. In the air, anywhere, everywhere. Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, gee willikers, it's time for Bible class. Oh no, it's 9:30. As shown, yes. Highland Village time now is 9:30. James, would you mind leading us in prayer? Amen. Good to have everybody here, and good morning. Uh, Looks like we are finally going to be in summer now. Looks like the rains are got turned off, furnace got turned on, or is being turned on, and I think we're going to have our dog days in August. Oh well, and until then, we will just have to be satisfied with some Saharan dust. So there's a bright golden haze in the meadow. It's it's yes, and on the skyline too. I was thinking about that, and that's why I have Oklahoma on my mind. Anyway, well, welcome everybody, and including those who are watching on live on their computer or tablets. We are continuing our study in the Gospel of Matthew, and if you haven't already, please turn in your Bibles or devices to Matthew chapter 14. That is where we are going to pick up. And we're going to see a little bit of a backstory here. Matthew is, I've noticed one thing, especially now reading as carefully as we have been with Matthew. He's basically kind of a Joe Friday kind of guy. You know, just the facts, just the facts. Well, this happened, and then this happened. Then we're moving on. But here he pauses the narrative, gives us a little bit of a backstory here. And we begin chapter 14 with, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus. And he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Well, if that's an interesting statement, because up to this point, the last time we left John the Baptist back in chapter 11, he was in prison. And he had sent his disciples to ask Jesus, "Hey, are you the Messiah? Are you the guy that we were prophesying about?" But obviously, there's been a few details that have happened since then. If Herod is wondering if John the Baptist has risen from the dead, well, he must be dead. And so Matthew tells us that backstory. But before we begin that backstory, a little bit of information about Herod. Herod is more precisely Herod Antipas, or Antipas. He is son of Herod the Great. That is the Herod that we met at the beginning of Matthew when Jesus was born. It was his dad, Herod the Great, who ordered the execution of all the kids 2 years and under, because he was afraid of this Messiah who had been born, King of the Jews. This is first of all, Herod the Tetrarch. Let's explain that title a little bit. The term tetrarch literally means ruler of a fourth part. Well, fourth part of what? We don't know, and doesn't seem quite to fit here. But anyway, the term tetrarch came to define any subordinate ruler of a section of a country. Doesn't have to be a fourth or a third or an eighth or a 16th or whatever. If you're a tetrarch, you're governing something, but not the whole thing. The Herods like to think of themselves as kings. Of course, this is the Roman Empire, where nobody is king when you've got an emperor in Rome who basically sees himself as ruler of the entire world. And Herod, at one point, asked for the title of king, which probably was not the most politically astute thing to do. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. But essentially, Herod ruled over the region of Galilee, which is why it matters what Herod is thinking and doing. He had two brothers who ruled areas to the north and the south of him. One was called Archelaus, the other was Philip, and Philip matters because of some details that we're about to find out. Anyway, John the Baptist is dead, and Herod is thinking, has he risen from the dead? Why would he think that? Well, Matthew continues in verse 3. Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It's not lawful for you to have her." What happened here? Well, apparently back in the good old days, Philip and Herodias were married, and then they weren't. Or maybe they didn't even worry about a divorce, but Herodias went over to Herod, and according to one account, they actually did get married. And John was protesting this. When Matthew says that John had been saying to him, "It's not lawful for you to have her," he didn't say it once. The original Greek implies that he was saying it to him repeatedly, and apparently enough to start getting on the nerves of both Herod and Herodias. So this is an example here. What happens sometimes when you speak truth to the power, power lashes back. Herod has John arrested, put in prison. He really wanted to kill him, verse 5, but he was afraid of the people because they considered John a prophet, and rightly so. And so that's where things kind of sat for a while. And then Herod's birthday rolls around. Verse 6. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for the guests. And it's, in all likelihood, this was not, she didn't grab a straw hat and a cane and, do a few Broadway show tunes, one singular sensation. Nothing like that. It was probably a little bit more provocative than that. In fact, it was probably a whole lot more provocative than that. We don't know the details. The scripture does not cover the details, but there was a playwright by the name of Oscar Wilde who tried to imagine what that scene was like, and he came up with a very seductive dance that the daughter did called the Dance of the Seven Veils, and I'll leave it there. But basically, it was very, very suggestive, if not downright indecent. In any event, it hit the spot. Herod was really pleased with what his stepdaughter was doing. So pleased that, verse 7, he promised with an oath, to give her whatever she asked. Mark, in his account of this, in chapter 6, said this was his oath. Ask for whatever you wish, and I will grant it. Whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half my kingdom. Oh, gee. Now, maybe Herod had been drinking. It was his birthday, and everybody was in a celebratory mood, and he's feeling good, feeling easy. Oh, gee, it's so nice that my stepdaughter, and by some accounts, probably my niece. I mean, this was one real dysfunctional family. Anyway, he's looking at her and just feeling very expansive, and he says, "Yeah, whatever you want, honey, I'll give it to you, even if it's half my kingdom." What she asked for is something just totally blindsides him, something that he didn't anticipate. According to Mark, the daughter runs to Herodias and says, "What shall I ask for?" And Herodias says, and Herodias, of course, who is holding a grudge against John the Baptist, waiting for a moment to get her chance at her, says, "Here's my chance." She tells her daughter, "Ask him for the head of John the Baptist." And that's what she does. Verse 8, prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." Give me here, meaning give me right now, this moment, not next week, not in a few days, not by close of the next business day, but right now, on a platter, the head of John the Baptist. Well, obviously, this is not what Herod expected. He expected something a little bit better, a little bit more grandiose. Hey, honey, how about a brand new chariot? Nope, this is what she wants. The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guest. Why because of the dinner guest? Because he's made this very expansive promise. I'll give you anything you want. And, afraid of losing face. I just told her I'd give her anything I want. I can't back down. And, of course, he can probably see that his wife is behind this. He's maybe a little bit afraid of his wife. And probably the fact that he's drunk and not thinking too clearly probably had something to do with it. But in any event, a calmer head would have said, "I'm sorry, but we can't do that." That's not what he thinks. He says, I can't lose face over this, so yeah, okay. He ordered that her request be granted and had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. I can't think of a more effective buzzkill for a party than to have something like this happen. You can almost see the guests just getting up and say, "Oh, well, it's kind of late, and we promised the sitter we'd be back home before 10, Nice party, Herod. Have a nice time. Sorry about the mess." Anyway, John is dead due to a very rash promise by Herod. John's disciples came and took John's body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. Before we go on, a little bit more background, and because I don't recall that Matthew has anything more to say about Herod, but Herod kind of met with some bad times of his own. I mentioned that he divorced his current wife, to marry Herodias. When he did that, it really got his father-in-law very angry. Father-in-law was not just any father-in-law. He was a ruler himself. He ruled a certain country, or a patch of country of his own. He was so upset with Herod that he went to war with him and won. And Herod wound up losing some ground. Not a good thing. Later on, his another relative, it was either his brother or maybe his nephew, depending on the way they intermarried in this family. Maybe he was both. A guy named Agrippa went to Rome and accused Herod of treason against Rome. He said, "Look at all these weapons that Herod is stockpiling. He's going to go war against you." And Herod, unfortunately, admitted that he had the stockpile. He didn't say, "But I'm not trying to attack you, dear emperor." The emperor didn't buy it. He had him banished to the very distant province of Gaul, which was somewhere in the area of France or Spain. And eventually, he and his wife Herodias committed suicide there. Now, whether they did it on their own or whether they were encouraged, Godfather style, to do it, if something happens to you, we'll look after your kids, and you got nothing to worry about. So, one of those things. But they came to a very, very unhappy end. And this whole downfall started after, as I mentioned earlier, Herod had asked to be given the title of king. The emperor didn't like that idea one bit. So that was the story in a nutshell of Herod, but we continue now with our story of Jesus, because there's a cause and effect here when Jesus learns of John's death and what the disciples had done. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place, intending to be alone so he could pray, I'm sure. But The crowds pick up, hey, Jesus is moving. Let's go follow him. And the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. It's interesting. Here he is in a boat sailing on a lake, and he can look over at the shore. These crowds are just following him along, just waiting to see where he's going to land. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Mark also adds that he also taught them. So it was a full session of healing and teaching. And as evening approached, verse 15, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Hey, great plan. Really? Matthew is going to mention to us is that the crowd is so big, there's at least 5,000 men. That doesn't include women and children. Okay, it's late in the day. Yeah, everybody go home, go get something to eat. So they go to these villages. You can imagine these little villages, and suddenly here are hundreds, if not thousands, of people coming in trying to find something to eat. You can imagine the chaos. Well, Jesus has an alternate plan, verse 16. He tells his disciples they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. Well, how can we do that, Lord? Verse 17, we have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered, which we find out, John tells us, was volunteered by a little boy in the crowd. Well, gee, it looks like a disaster in the making, or is it? Because John also adds that Jesus is having this conversation with the disciples to test them because he knew what he was going to do. And indeed, he does it. Verse 18, he says, "Bring the food, bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. And he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. Very interesting. We have what here is not just feeding the crowd, but it's feeding them banquet style. He didn't just give them boxed lunches and send them on their way. He had everybody sit down on the grass. And so, hey guys, we're having a party here. And how much food was there? What was the result? They all ate and were satisfied. How much food was there? The disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish that were left over. 12 apostles, 12 baskets, gee, 1 for each of them at least. That was very interesting. You can imagine one of those apostles holding this basket of food that they didn't have earlier and wondering about it. Matthew tells us in verse 21, the number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. It's very frustrating when you see these crowd estimates, and it's all done strictly according to the number of adult males. And so you have to figure out some kind of multiplier, and depending on the multiplier that you want to use, this is a crowd that numbered, according to some commentaries, maybe somewhere between 15 to 20,000 people. So, you know, the equivalent of a medium small town. Very, very big crowd, and yet more than enough food to satisfy them. Tells you one thing. Basically, God is extravagant. You ask him for his help, and he helps you. It's more than you imagine. Well, here's another little piece of information that Matthew doesn't tell us about. When he goes into verse 22, he says, immediately Jesus made the disciples get in the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. What Matthew doesn't tell us is what John does, which is that when the people have this wonderful banquet, this food, and this crowd, basically Jesus is in predominantly Jewish territory. The audience is predominantly Jewish. Many of them, of course, waiting with some expectation of the coming Messiah. When is he going to come? When he comes, he's going to be powerful, and he's going to do things like reinstate the manna from heaven. We'll be fed adequately now from now on. And seeing this as a sign, they say, hey, this is the guy. He's the Messiah. He's gonna feed us. He's gonna overthrow the Romans. Let's go grab him and put him in power and get her done. Get rid of those Romans once and for all. Basically, the crowd was saying, now's the time, Jesus. And Jesus is saying, not. This is not my time. So, basically, Jesus implements a little bit of crowd control. One of the first things he does was to tell the disciples, get in the boat, get back in the water. And Matthew says, or this translation here says, he made the disciples get in the boat. Original Greek is more like Jesus compelled the disciples to get in the boat. Don't argue with me. Get in now. And so he dismisses the disciples while he goes over and dismisses the crowd. Okay, have a great time. Thanks for coming. Please go home now. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night. So he was up on the mountainside praying a long time. We think we're praying a long time if we take 5 minutes. And I include myself in that expectation. Anyway, while Jesus is praying, nighttime comes, and by late night, the boat was already a considerable distance from land and having a bit of a rough time because it was tossed, it was buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Basically, they were trying to row over to the other side of the lake. Good luck, because the wind is not being at all helpful. And they're probably going up and down, up and down, up. I don't know about you. If I were in that situation, I'd be thinking about, okay, I'm about to lose the lunch that I just had on ground. I'm probably number one candidate for seasickness. I don't know, but these guys, at least some of them anyway, or fishermen, might have been used to it, but still not fun to try to navigate that boat, and the elements are not cooperating at all. And cooperating to the point that it is now early morning, they're still out in the middle of the lake. Shortly before dawn, verse 25. Your translation may read, in the fourth watch. What's a watch? Well, basically they break up. The Jewish folks and the Roman folks broke up the hours of the day in what they called watches. And the fourth watch here is sometime between 3 and 6 in the morning. So that's how long they've been out on the lake. I'd be worn out. We'll just sit here in the lake. We'll just circle around, whatever. Which is probably what they were doing. But shortly before dawn, they see this apparition, or what seems to be an apparition, but it's actually Jesus, because Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. I would be too, because this is a sight that defies all common sense. No one walks on the water. But here's Jesus doing that very thing. But you try to processing. Can't be a real human being. It's got to be a ghost. Got to be a ghost. It's a ghost, they said, cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus said to them, take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. One of those phrases that Jesus says repeatedly, because we need to hear it. We need to be reminded, don't be afraid. Then Peter says something very interesting. Verse 28, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. Now obviously was a bold request. Was it unusual? Well, probably not. Keep in mind, number one, Peter's a fisherman. And he's also, has some a little bit familiarity of being out on a boat, being in the water, if not on it. And by now he's experienced some degree of training with Jesus, spending some time. And he knows his faith is not perfect by any means, but he has enough faith so that he to know that Jesus can do anything, especially if Jesus tells him to do something. Also, look at the phrase, Lord, if it's you. The original Greek here could also be translated in a way that where Peter is saying, Lord, since it's you. So Peter, in that sense, was not doubting what he was seeing. He knew it was Jesus. And he said, Lord, since it is you, why don't you tell me to come out and meet you on the water? Tell me to do it. Give me the commandment, and I know I can do it. Now, that is faith. Jesus accepts the request. He says, come. And Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But, big but here, verse 30, when he saw the wind, human nature took over. Saw the wind, the waves. His, what we call common sense came back to him. What am I doing here? He said, and his human nature takes over. He was afraid. And what happened when he was afraid? Which is what Jesus told him not to be. Don't be afraid. Peter gets afraid. What happens? He starts to sink. And at that point, the only thing he can do is to cry out to Jesus and say, Lord, save me. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? Interesting, if you do the parsing of the word doubt literally means divided in two. The spiritual side of Peter saw Jesus, saw he could do this, with Jesus' power, he could walk on water, he could do anything that he needed to do to carry out the will of God. And then there was Peter's human side, who saw all the reasons why it couldn't be done, and that part of his brain that bought into it. That's what doubt is about. You're literally divided. You're literally of two minds. You're beside yourself. Verse 32, when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. Interestingly, when you read this account in the Gospel of John, John says after this moment of worship, they cross over immediately. Like 1 second, they're in the middle of the lake, boom. Next second, they're ashore. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, and a note about Gennesaret, they're on the western shore south of Capernaum, which is Jesus' home base here. And here they are back in Herod's jurisdiction. Not that that's a great matter of concern right now. But they're back in a region where people are well aware of Jesus. They've heard the news about him. They know what he has done. They know what he can do. When the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak. It's interesting when in Acts we read of, I think it's Peter, the news about Peter and his miraculous properties in terms of healing people. People were so taken over by that the rumor became that, hey, if you just let his shadow pass over you, you will be healed. The idea of just touching if I just touch him, I'll be healed. And to do this was a brave thing because it was against Jewish custom to be touching someone you didn't know. In fact, Jewish custom taught that if at all possible, you avoided crowds because it's kind of like don't put your finger in your mouth. You don't know where it's been. Well, you don't know where these people have been. You don't know who you're going to touch when you touch them or when they touch you. They may have just touched an unclean thing, a dead animal or whatever. If they touch you, you're unclean for the rest of the day. And if you touch them, it's not much help to you or them anyway. But, when you're sick, this is a time and an age where they just did not have the medical care that we're used to today. If you were sick, chances very good you would die. You had some remedies, some cures, which are primitive by today's standards for sure, but they were limited in their effectiveness and what they could do. So anytime you heard of somebody who was a miracle healer, who was in the neighborhood, hey, I don't care what my daddy or my granddaddy or what the local rabbi told us to do or not to do. I'm going to see that man because I want to be healed, or I want my daughter to be healed. I want my daddy to be healed. You would do it. And of course, yes. Yes. Of course. Yes. Mhm. Oh, um, I don't know if, for the benefit of our folks who are watching online, Darren made the note or the observation in Acts chapter 19. There was a passage where there were cloths that were just touched by Paul, passed around, and they had healing properties. And there are some folks who, some less than ethical televangelists who say, oh, here's an actual cloth that was touched by Paul or by Jesus, and or by them, yes, and for a love offering of $50, $200, hey, this can be your very cloth, and it will take care of whatever problems you're having. And the nice thing about Jesus is he didn't charge for his services, and was he pleased to heal people? Obviously. Whatever he could do to alleviate the suffering of the crowds around him, because as Matthew and Mark observed, he had compassion because they needed help. They weren't getting it from the people who were supposedly leaving them or leading them. And the nice thing here is that, anyone that he touched, they were healed. Next week, we're going to have a little bit of conversation. In fact, there will be this interesting little episode encounter with the mother of a young girl who's sick and his response. And very unusual encounter, but I think it's something worth spending a little bit of time and looking into and exploring it. Anyway, we'll draw to a close here, and if you will, please, for next week, be reading chapters 15 and 16. That'll be the basis of our lesson for next Sunday. Really appreciate you all being here today. And, of course, to all of you who are watching online, have a great week, and we will see you next Sunday.